everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So today we are going to talk about the 4 core skills that underlie language. And these specifically are categorization, how we label these categories, sequencing behaviors together, and mimicry and why it's important. So some of these skills are also seen in other animals, such as apes and birds, and also in cute little bees. But let's consider their role in human language first. So let's go over these one by one in this video. Okay, the first one up is categorization. So in our brain, multiple parallel and hierarchical neural channels function to process incoming sensory information. So a lot of information is coming in and our brain has to process this. So as our cortex expands and a number of channels that process these parallel sensory information that's incoming, whenever that increases, it becomes very difficult to integrate the information from all these parallel sensory processing streams. So the brain has to decide and determine which sensory information it allows to come in. So you cannot process everything in your environment, so all the senses, all the sensory information in your environment, that would be way too much for your brain. So your brain filters the sensory information that comes in. And you can only let certain bits of sensory information in. So the brain also needs to determine which kind of sensory information that reaches the cortex comes from where in our external world. So it becomes necessary to categorize information. So our brain categorizes sensory information that comes in. And it technically sorts the information in different category bins. So assigning tags to information makes it easier to perceive the information than and to retrieve it later on whenever we need it. So most animals are capable of organizing objects to some extent, but humans have a very sophisticated categorization system. So if you remember all the way back from chapter 13, when we talked about the occipital lobes, we have ventral visual stream that courses through the temporal lobes, and it participates in object categorization. And then we have the dorsal stream, which goes to the parietal lobes, and this is important for making distinctions between objects. So an example of this would be knowing that a plant is different from an animal, for example. Okay, the second part or the second skill is labeling. So we have to label these categories. So words are technically the best categorizers. But to be able to use these words to label a category, you need to understand what categories are. So the development of human language may have entailed selection for novel ways of categorizing that not only allows us to combine and group simple sensory stimuli, but it also provides a way of organizing events and relations into different categories. So labeling categories can stimulate the production of word forms about that category. And labeling category does not only include identifying a category, which is a function of our temporal lobes, but it also organizes information within that category. So, for example, here you have a category that could be considered a category of tools, but within this category, you can also categorize items together. So, for example, these 3 wrenches, they have a similar function or almost same function, so they are categorized together within a bigger category of tools. Okay, so the third skill that underlies language is sequencing behavior. So human language employs transitional larynx movements to form different syllables. So in speech, left hemisphere structures that are involved with language form a part of a system that has a fundamental role in ordering vocal movements such as those in speech. And we can also sequence face, body, and arm movements to produce nonverbal language. Sequencing words to represent meaningful actions makes us use the same dorsal stream frontal cortex circuits that sequence these motor actions more generally. So we're also going to talk about dorsal and ventral stream within language in a later video. Okay, and the last one is mimicry. So mimicry fosters development. So it has actually been shown in research that babies show a preference for listening to speech over other sounds. And when they begin to babble, they're capable of making the sounds used in all languages. They also mimic and subsequently prefer the language sounds made by the people that are close to them, so in their environment. So, for example, their mom or their dad. And in the formative years, kiddos may add as many as 60 new words each day to their vocabulary. So here we're going to go back to those mirror neurons. So we talked about motor system neurons. We talked about that in the motor chapter. So mirror neurons in the motor system, they respond when we see others make a movement, and then also when we mimic that movement or when we copy that movement. So one view related to mimicry is that mirror neurons in the cortical language regions are responsible for our ability to mimic sounds. And we can also mimic words and actions that comprise language. Okay, so speech is more than just sounds. So most of our speech, so about like 90% of it, is accompanied by gestures. And sometimes body language can help, or it can also interfere, so it can be confusing. So let's go over two effects. So let's go over the cocktail effect first. So when you are at a cocktail party, for example, and you're talking to someone, and when at the same time you can hear 3 other guests behind you chat about, let's say, their summer vacations or something. But you are able to filter that out so you can focus on what the person in front of you is saying. So often it is easier when you see their lips make certain sounds or form certain words. So this effect of filtering and making it easier when you focus on the lips is called the cocktail party effect. And it has to do with our auditory attention. So our brain focuses our auditory attention on a particular stimulus while filtering out a range of other stimuli. And this auditory attention primarily occurs in the left hemisphere of the superior temporal gyrus. And you all know by now where that is. But there's also a frontal parietal network, which involves the inferior frontal gyrus, superior parietal sulcus, and the intraparietal sulcus, which also account for acts of attentional shifting, speech processing, and attentional control. And then you also have the McGurk effect. So this is something that when you, for example, see someone say ah, but you hear something else, so you hear like e. So when we see and hear conflicting syllables, we end up hearing the syllable that we heard. So then we focus on the audition rather than what we see. So if you see someone shape their lips to say ah, and we hear e, we will say that we heard e. Okay, so this is the end of this video, and I will see you all back soon for the next video.